Thank you. Welcome to everyone. My name is Roberto Lovato. I'm a journalist and writer based in San Francisco at the Writers Grotto and native San Franciscan. Go Giants. Um, I want to thank the World Affairs Council and the European Institute at my alma mater, Berkeley, for inviting me for what I think is, alongside with climate change, one of the issues of our time because it's the human manifestation of the effects of climate change. And I also want to just, as a begin, giving a little context for what we're talking about. I was on a walk over here from my office on 2nd Street, and I passed a Syrian woman on the street with a sign, "Please help me," that either she or someone had, and then her kids were walking around, and they're usually there around like the Montgomery Street BART station. And I'm Salvadoran, and so I run into Salvadoran refugees. I'm going to a conference of 500 unaccompanied minors tomorrow in Los Angeles. So these are issues that are very much among us, within us, and a part of us that aren't some foreign, distant thing. And I believe it's important to just start with that and end with that because it. So despite their youth, I want to say that our guests, our speakers today, have been able to navigate the long journey from the analog era of refugee reporting to now the digital era of reporting, which is now just I think reporting of a moment of another order. Especially when you look at headlines like the ones I'm going to mention. Just this week, the nativist one in Europe, The Atlantic. UN refugee chief blames New Zealand mosque attack on, quote, toxic politics connected to refugees. President Trudeau government slammed over, quote, callous plans to reject refugees with asylum claims in the US. And of course, here in the United States this week, we saw President Trump cutting crucial aid to Central America, stirring fears of a worsening refugee crisis in this part of the hemisphere, this part of the world. A story of the decline and fall and resignation of Homeland Security Chief Christian Nielsen, you could argue, has a lot to do with refugees and reflects, I think, as we were discussing earlier, the centrality of, the sudden centrality of refugee politics in US politics generally, something I'd not seen prior. I think we're seeing it in other countries, and the rise of white nationalist Stephen Miller to head the immigration policy of the United States. And of course, today's news with the headline, "Dangerous people are coming here and good people are dying," Trump warns in Texas visit. So with these kinds of headlines, we're challenged as journalists to really try to navigate this and bring a modicum of the truth that Giovanna's book has in its opening quote. I forget the exact quote, but it mentioned to those who pursue the truth. And so let me start off with Giovanna. What is the role of journalism right now in the refugee crisis, in a world of false, misleading ideas online? And how do we cover controversial, emotional issues in an era when increasing number of people don't believe the media at a time when the President of the United States attacks the media for, as he did today, for promoting fake, quote unquote, fake news. And you wrote a book to this effect, so let's start there.
Thank you, Roberto, and thanks to all of you for being here on a gorgeous day that I understand is rare to have the sunshine in San Francisco. So double thanks for being here. The role of journalism in covering refugee crisis, plural, because there are multiple around the world, not just in the Americas, but in Europe, and let's not forget, of course, in the global South, where the situation sometimes is even more dire than in the global North, has really become imperiled by a credibility crisis that paradoxically, I believe, has stemmed from some of that reporting itself. So let me kind of explain that. First of all, the story of people wanting to find a better life and or having to leave their home because it literally is impossible to continue to live there is an old story. It's certainly not something that just happened in the last 5 years or so. The
Really?
numbers, however, are unprecedented. We're talking about hundreds of thousands this year in the United States alone, if the latest numbers from the Customs and Border Protection Agency are to be believed, then we'll keep up. In Europe, in the peak era that Jean covered in 2015 and 2016, it was closer to 2 million people. That's massive. But also the distance that people went, both geographically and culturally, is huge. That number itself is huge. It used to be, and it still is, that the people who are displaced, who have to leave their homes because of causes beyond their control, go to neighboring countries or remain, sort of broadly speaking, in their region. Today, in an era of social media, in an era where travel has become much easier to arrange, where stories and false information navigate so quickly, people are traveling enormous distances from, little indigenous Mayan villages in the Guatemalan highlands to Indianapolis and Newark, from, rural Afghanistan to Berlin. Those distances, again, culturally too, are immense. That makes the story important and at the same time really challenging to cover. And I think the biggest challenge has been paradoxical, which is this. In academia, we like to criticize the media for negative coverage. That's if you read one report, you've read them all, and it's always the media perpetuates stereotypes about refugees with their negative coverage. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but the vast majority of professional journalism that I have read actually has been giving in the last few years a strikingly humanistic perspective on what has been happening, focusing on the very real humanitarian crisis. It has done a much poorer job focusing on what the consequences are of this movement of people for themselves and also for the host countries. I mean, Jean has done 2 stories, and I'm sure she'll tell you about. One focusing on resettled refugees in France from their perspective, but then also in Germany, or was it Austria and Germany, from the perspective of the people in the town. Now, you might think, and there is sort of a reflex on certain parts of the public to think that, well, the story is all about the refugees, and if anybody has any issue with that whatsoever, they're just racist morons, and that's the end of that. But that simplification has been very skillfully highlighted by precisely those anti-immigrant forces that they say, look, the media are lying to you because there are problems. Of course there are. First of all, for the refugees themselves. But the media are not covering those. And so don't trust the media. We will tell you. Let me give you one example that's straight off the headlines, like Roberto, you were talking about. And this has just happened in the last week or so in Greece, specifically in the town of Diavata. Rumors were spread. It's not entirely clear by whom. Maybe an NGO. It's not clear who it was, but they were spread in Arabic through social media that there was suddenly on April 5th, at a certain time in the morning, the border between Greece and North Macedonia, which has been sealed for asylum seekers and refugees and migrants in general since almost a little over 3 years ago, since March of 2016, was going to be opened. That was actually a total lie. Problem is that, of course, if you're desperate and you want to move, you'll believe it. And thousands of people moved, and they were faced by, Greek and North Macedonian police that faced off with them. And there was stun grenades and tear gas and rock throwing and all of these things, all based on false information put out there, God only knows why.
And that's a perfect segue, because I was going to ask Jean, who's spent some time reporting in Greece, in Turkey, on precisely these issues. I wanted to get her sense of an article we were discussing earlier, and of the situation generally, in the New York Times that was titled "Rumors of Open Border Prompt Migrant Protests." And so I don't need to give context. So I want Jean, you to share your experience in reporting these matters and looking at the way this is played out, especially the part about fake news giving rise to a riot.
Well, thank you. Nice to be here. And yes, I've been up on the border between Greece and Macedonia, and what happened, this rumor spread, and people who are stuck in camps around Greece hear these rumors. They don't feel like anything's happening. They don't feel like they have a future. They're probably not getting good information. So you want to believe it. And I was following it on social media, of course, because I could follow it very closely through certain journalists who were at the border, and it reminded me of things that I saw in Edomeni, which was the big camp that formed on the border between Greece and Macedonia in 2016. Almost every day, rumors would ripple through the camp, and people would rush the border, hoping that it was going to open. And it was very interesting when you're a reporter around this. What do you do? Do you say, well, sometimes I would know that the rumor was not true. Other times I wouldn't know for sure. Mostly I wouldn't say anything. But I can tell you my observation a lot of time was that people were driven by hope. And I think it's something that would happen to us, any of us, in the same situation. One rumor that was very prevalent in 2015 when I was in Turkey, and that's when there were literally hundreds of thousands of people trying to cross over into Greece, somebody came up and asked me if it was true that Merkel was going to send a boat to pick them up. And people really wanted to believe that. And in that case, I had to say, no, she's definitely not going to do that. But you find yourself as a journalist, as an arbiter sometimes, in this swirling world of stories. And it's hard enough for me as a journalist to kind of get the story straight. And then when all of this is happening, it's quite an environment.
So Giovanna, you're now both journalist and scholar, able to take the 10,000-foot view of these matters. So how do we combat fake news on refugee crisis issues?
Well, that's a tough question, isn't it? It's a $10,000 question, really. I think, first of all, we can't give up. As journalists, we can't abdicate what is our role, which I love how the U.S. Society of Professional Journalists puts it. First one is an obligation to the truth. You're right. The dedication to the book is to, I believe, is to those who fearlessly seek truth.
Yes.
Because you have to be fearless in this kind of environment. Let's not forget that it is very dangerous to be a journalist covering these issues. Most of the countries that refugees are coming from are the countries where the highest number of journalists are killed, particularly nationals of those countries, but also foreign journalists. So it is literally dangerous. Along the journey, all of these journeys, whether we're talking about the Mediterranean, the Aegean, the Sahara, or we're talking about Central America, Mexico, the Southwest U.S.-Mexican border, all of these journeys are controlled by criminal organizations, by mafias. Like literally nobody is doing this alone at this point, or extremely few people are. Those mafias do not welcome inquisitive journalists. So there are dangers, and yet we can't give it up, because I think the only way to go forward is to continue to try to be, and I'm going to be controversial on purpose, apolitical in this, and try to really get at the truth of what's happening. The truth for the refugees, the truth for the communities that they're leaving, the truth for the communities that they are going to. All of those stories need to be told. And one of the things that I found most encouraging, particularly in Europe, talking with journalists, was that they said, we also need to do more reporting on where anti-immigrant sentiment is coming from. Why is it so much on the rise? Why is it so politically expedient now to say the equivalent of, let's not send rescue boats in the Mediterranean anymore, or let's build that wall? Why is that so successful? It's imperative that journalists do not try to produce simplistic narratives, caricatures on one side or the other, but try to really dig through without, saying this is good, this is evil. I think the non-black and white binary is essential.
Jean, do you want to add to that in terms of how do we combat this?
Yeah. The way we combat it is, we do have to keep witnessing. And one thing about social media era is that we can pretend that we know what's going on, seeing it virtually, but it's not the same. And this is the role that journalists play. It's very important that we're able to have our eyes, on the ground. And that is not as easy as it sounds. There's issues with access all the time. I found this in Greece. It was very difficult to get access to the camps. So you can't really see what's going on. I know this is an issue for journalists on the border. And these are very core issues to journalism that we absolutely cannot ever accept, that we do not have access to able to witness and tell these stories. So I think that role is as as important now as it has ever been. And with this story, because it's a global story, people are often in remote areas, we really have to make the effort to get to see people where they are if we're going to understand what's going on. And this requires support. I really think that we need to have a regular beat in all newspapers that's some kind of migration beat that is an absolutely normal part of, just like we have housing and economics, basically. It's that big a story.
You know, Jean, your comments made me front load a question I was going to say for later, but I think it's good now about, because I think what you're describing, the perfect symbol for it is a wall. The wall to the truth, the wall to the things they don't want us to talk about. So how do walls and the way that the news cycle, because right now we're living in an age where journalists are chasing the news cycle as never before because it's driven by the most popular publisher in the history of the world, Donald Trump, right? This is what scholars of media are telling us. So how does a wall and the focus on walls and the politics of walls shape the refugee issue for better or for worse, perhaps? In your views, either one.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's really interesting that you should mention walls, because if you think about it, when we're talking about migration, we're inherently talking about borders. So whether you think they should exist or not, they're there, and that's the whole point. I mean, to migrate, you have to move across borders. It's also easier, in a sense, to focus on that movement than it is to focus on any other aspect of it. It's visual, right? I'm also going to front load one of your questions. I mean, maybe, I'm assuming all of you, if you're here, have seen the truly heart-rending picture of Aylan Kurdi, the Syrian toddler who washed on a shore, dead on a Turkish beach and was picked up by police. I mean, that seared global consciences, but for how long? For a couple of moments. Yes, everybody was like, oh, we got to do something, we got to do something. It's like, okay, well, yep, and it's still happening. They're still there. They're still stuck in Greece. They're still trying to make it across. Syria is still the place it is with no easy solution in sight. So part of the problem, I think, with that focus on the easy slogans and on the borders is that we're missing what happens beyond borders. What happens at the second set of borders, if you will, which are schools, jobs, families, cultural issues. I mean, but those are much harder to explore, in fairness. So
and
we go back to Jean's
don't
point.
want those stories. They just don't, they're not as sexy. It's a challenge.
And based on what you were just saying, Jean, if I can just interject one thing, let's not forget that one of the biggest challenges of journalism for the last 20 years is that there's no money in it. The internet, wonderful, but destroyed. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it destroyed the business model. So where is the money going to come from for this type of reporting? I tell my students, when I talk about this, it's like, well, we can all do something. We can, I'm joking, but not completely. We can fool the algorithms if we all keep clicking on these stories and keep them open long enough. But every time we're going to look up, baby Sussex, well, there you go. We have just, you know what I'm talking about, the upcoming birth, a royal birth or whatever in England. Mm-hmm. We're just proving that that's where to put more reporting money, as opposed to a story about refugees that might just sort of die out.
Yeah, well, it's a humanitarian story, to go back to that point, but it's also a structural story. And this is something that I think it's just a global failure of the media, certainly in the US. I mean, we have some really great reporting going on now that is connecting the dots. Absolutely, Reveal and ProPublica and a lot of places. But unfortunately, that's not the media reaching most people, and I don't think that it's really defining how the major public is understanding this issue. And I just think among the things that we have to do as editors and reporters is we have to connect the dots. We have to look at why people are traveling, and then we have to follow up. For instance, all that reporting I've done on the island of Lesbos, which was sort of the epicenter of arrivals in the Aegean in 2015, I was just back there, and I'm starting to work on a book about one day. And the reason I wanted to do it was I wanted to see what happened. And actually, there's a lot of trauma among the locals there that were the most helpful, the fishermen, Coast Guard who were out. Many of them have post-traumatic stress. They don't have a culture of therapy there. Those are among the people that were helping. Among the population there that was unsure, there's actually, the far right has taken advantage, and the Golden Dawn is on the rise and could in fact be the third party in the elections there. And I agree with very much that we can't just do a black and white, very stereotypical story that it's always great to have refugees. We may support refugees and migrants as people and sympathize, but we have to look at what it means for local populations where they're arriving and understand that dynamic. That's a big part of the story.
You want to add something?
Can I just jump in with something? Sorry, yes. Which is basically this, I agree 100%, and I think that one of the most dangerous things that I have seen happening in the last few years in journalism, in many, many reputable media organizations, is this idea that, well, the stakes are just too high right now. We're going to give up objectivity and you know, just follow our hearts, so to speak. Now, I totally get that. At the same time, I think that when the stakes are high, it's precisely when it's imperative for journalists not to become partisans. Now, if you want to be partisans for humanity, yes, by all means, by default, we are. But when it comes to different reporting based on, for example, who's sitting in the White House, that's very problematic to me.
And I actually, that beautifully, they're reading my mind as I speak. I had a question about the politics of reporting trauma, the politics of reporting refugee issues generally. I remember last year's child separation crisis. We all remember that, thousands of children. We're still living with the results of these policies and practices. And I took a different tack in this piece I did for the Columbia Journalism Review, which was, I went and I asked refugees what they thought of the coverage. Who'd have thought? There weren't that many, not too many people have asked refugees what they think of the coverage. So I went and asked a woman named Ana Luna, who had been in an immigrant prison, basically, with her kids, and was threatened with separation, and you know, she said she was tortured. They were fed what she called dog vomit, quote unquote, and you know, but these women also organized themselves, and they organized hunger strikes, which you hardly didn't hear reported. And so I asked Anna, what do we think of the coverage? She goes, well, it's great. They're really, the media's changed. They're really going aggressively against the president. But they didn't report like this when I was in jail, because she was in jail in 2015. And the president was not Donald Trump. It was Barack Obama. And who, you know, if you try to pitch stories about the imprisonment practices of the Obama administration and the detentions and the child separations, does anybody know how many children were separated by the Obama administration in 2011? Separations, child separations. No, Trump is well on his way to breaking that record, but the Obama administration separated, according to the Applied Research Institute Center and other groups, 5,100 children were separated from their parents in 2011 alone. Did this get did anybody know this before? No. They did things on detention and they did things on deportation, but nobody talked about child separation in the Obama administration. And you try to pitch the story like some of us did, and editors would not accept them. And I'll just be myself here and be immoderate for a moment and say that I think it has a lot to do with the politics in the editorial room that you were referring to. In some of these reputable organizations. And so we're living in a world where it's not just Fox. And I think I want to ask you, what do you think is behind this? And how can we overcome it, more importantly? The polarization where we seem to be going back to 19th century patterns of media, where in the 19th century, you have your media and you're on your side and your politics, and I have mine over on this side. We've lost kind of that center, we're losing that center that gives us a modicum of truth. So,
well, I think we've been losing the center in our media in the U.S. for a long time. I mean, that's been unraveling really since the whole internet, started. I just think that politics and journalism, I mean, there's always a back and forth. I think it's particularly challenging and toxic right now. But that's why the work of places like Reveal and ProPublica and,
The Intercept.
Sometimes The Intercept, sometimes the New York Times, that are really trying to frame the story around what they think is the truth, separate from politics. I just think that we have to remember how important that is. I don't think there's any simple fix for this except good journalism and trying to tell the truth. And, sometimes I thought, well, if I'm an independent reporter or if anybody's independent, that means, and I know you've chosen an independent route yourself, and so that gives you a chance to frame your own story. But it can be difficult to sell those stories. And I just think that I don't really believe that there is objective truth. I don't even mind if I over-identify with a refugee in a story, as long as I tell you I'm doing that. And I think that these are the kind of muscles that we have to work more, both as journalism professionals and also as the audience, so that the audience is smart enough to understand what the biases are, why they're there, where they're coming from. Some are unconscious, some are conscious, and just really hold ourselves to high standards around that.
I think something that Jean just mentioned is crucial, and that's transparency. And I think this is really becoming more, on the part of journalists and media organizations, this is becoming more and more one of the ways, one of the sort of more healthy effects of this confidence crisis. It's like, okay, actually the public doesn't understand how the sausage is made. They don't necessarily understand, newsroom conversations and editorial decisions and the constraints that are there, institutional, financial, etc. So can we tell them? Maybe that's a way of opening up the conversation to the broader public. One of the, in Europe, the German journalists, from what I've, at least from my own research, have been among the hardest hit. Now, you might also know that the response, the so-called Willkommenskultur, the welcome culture that greeted refugees and asylum seekers and migrants in 2015, 2016, was very quickly taken by the AfD and similar parties as a reason to say, aha, see, the liberal media,
these are the right-wing parties in Germany.
Yes, are lying to you. They're masquerading, the success story. There are lots of problems, and the media doing the same things. And journalists were like, okay, well, we need to address this. We can't address it by suddenly saying, okay, yes, you were right, it's all wrong, and let's go and do negative reporting, because that's not the truth either. So what they tried to do was engage the part of the audience that was not really having any belief in professional media anymore. And for example, starting publishing with any major stories, two sort of boxes. One, what we know. We've seen this, here is what we know. US organizations do it too. But then also a parallel one, here's what we don't know. Honestly, these are the questions that still remain to be answered. We don't have an answer for everything. We're journalists. We can't. You guys went the independent route. In my professional journalism career, I went, in a sense, the complete opposite, which is working for one of the oldest and largest news organizations in the world, the Associated Press, which more and more, when it comes to foreign coverage, is one of the major sources for the majority of the English-speaking world, really, and certainly in the United States. And one, I like to quote their top editor right now, a woman, by the way, I will mention, Sally Busby, who said famously in late 2016, responding to exactly those type of concerns, how are we going to cover the Trump presidency, et cetera, well, as journalists, we have to cover the world as it is, not as we wish it were.
Yeah.
And I think that's, in its simplicity, which is, again, not simple at all, it's expensive and dangerous to do this, that's the most important thing.
So the AP, for those of you that don't know, is a cooperative
Correct.
business model. We're going to ask some questions soon, sir. Thank you. So it reminds me of another question I had about who's doing, I want to ask you, Giovanna, who's doing the innovative work to get us close to this storied transparency that you were describing just now? And who's doing it specifically on refugee issues that, what are the best practices right now you're seeing out there in terms of the reporting on refugee issues here in the Americas, in Europe, and let's not forget Asia, because there's a north-south divide that divides the entire planet, and it includes Asia, as you see in the case of Bangladesh and other places there. And so what are the best practices right now? Who's doing things right?
Well, I think it's a mix. Journalism has changed in the sense that there's the ability now for a lot more voices, non-profits, other organizations, independent journalists to work on this. Best practices. Okay, first of all, what Jean just said, you've got to be there. You have to be in place to report this. It doesn't matter that we have social media, that we can Skype everybody, anybody, all times. You've got to be there. If you don't smell it, literally, actually, very often in these circumstances, yeah, we're both laughing, don't ask us. But if you don't smell these situations, you just don't know what it's like, the dust in the air, the grit, you've got to know that. So we've got to get journalists there. And that opens up, again, the very serious question of how to protect the safety of journalists in conflict zones, and unfortunately, in zones that are not conflict zones, but that are, again, ridden by mafias and criminal organizations. So that's the first thing. Second thing is to make sure that there is some sort of, again, transparency to the product itself. That we clearly say this is not the end-all kind of article or documentary or whatever format you might be. These are the questions we were able to answer. This is what remains to be said. And then I think, and this is, again, something that I heard many of our German colleagues say, is to try to understand not just the refugee story, but the citizen story, so to speak. In other words, very often that's a story that doesn't get told. But there are, particularly, again, when we're talking about the numbers that we're talking about, impacts, good and bad, on local communities. And those voices have tended not to be reported as often, for obvious reasons. Because it's more newsworthy, the newer person than the one who's been there for generations. But I think that if we're talking about how the future will change for many of our communities and our countries, then that story needs to be told too.
I just want to mention quickly, when I was in Germany in 2017, I reported on, I was in Bavaria, and it's just an example of how when we're reporting in areas that are known to be more conservative, it was an area, the village I was in, they had AfD rallies, which is a more right-wing party. But actually going out there and talking to people, I found that in that community, there were many, many people who were helping refugees, and I just found a very nuanced situation among the population. And I think that we would find that here in the U.S. I'm in contact with a guy from Islamic Relief USA who I met on Lesbos in 2015. And he came all the way from here to Lesbos to help people who were arriving at that time. He and I talk every once in a while, and I've asked him what it's like to be a Muslim out there doing, Islamic Relief is sort of like a Red Cross, but they're Islamic. And, they go where hurricanes are, and they go to places like that. In fact, I met him in Flint, Michigan, and did a story on him because they were distributing water. And you know what he tells me? He says, Jean, actually, people just know that we're there to help, and they very, very rarely have issues. And this is sometimes in totally red counties. And I just think that these complexities and nuances are very, very important. And one other thing to say about best practices, language, and getting more original language speakers out there on these beats. For instance, I don't speak Arabic, I don't speak Turkish, I don't speak Greek, I don't speak Dari, I don't speak Farsi, and all the other languages I was dealing in. I do speak Spanish, but anyway, that makes a difference to pay attention to language.
I just want to ask briefly if you could tell us some journalists or outlets that our audience and listeners can look for. Like we just saw in this last week in the New Yorker, actually, oddly enough, we had a good piece by Jonathan Blitzer on Guatemala, a country that we all have experience with here. And so, can you name any other journalists or examples that you look for? I mean, I know like Oscar Martinez in El Salvador's intrepid, incredible
Who's the
writer.
reporter at The Atlantic, a young woman who's doing very good work. There's 2 reporters at The New Yorker that are doing very good work. I do think ProPublica is incredible. I think Reveal is doing some very good work. Those are the ones that come to mind. There's also specialty publications, something called Iran News that's now called the New Humanitarian. This is just if you want to nerd out on nonprofit or on these kinds of issues. But I feel as a reader, because I'm a journalist, but I'm also a reader, and I'm as behind as everybody else, you just have to be voracious and seek out different sources and put things together. In a way, if you have that habit, you can be more informed now than ever. What I worry about is that a lot of people don't have that habit.
And I'll true
The
to
AP.
form. Yeah, okay, yes. No, but yes, the New York Times still does really good immigration coverage. They had a fantastic story today. It's surprisingly...
The World.
Exactly, PRI, Public Radio, and NPR and PRI do fantastic work. AP and the wire services. If you're looking for day-to-day, that's really pretty much where it's at. But I will add one more thing, which I think is really important, and that is that regardless of your linguistic skills, many foreign publications in Greece, in Germany, will have weekly, if not more frequent, English inserts or web pages, etc. So why not Kathimerini, which is the largest newspaper in Greece? They do publish fantastic stories in English. They've done reporting from Greece, etc. We've met. So that's, for example, Die Zeit and Der Spiegel also do. So it's not, so you can also think literally outside of our English-speaking box and kind of look at some of those sources, again, because the closer you are to the ground, and that's why I'm such a big fan of the wire services, but the closer you are to the ground and local newspapers, the better informed, the more nuanced, usually, those stories are. So I think that's, if you want to say something positive about this digital era, that's one of the biggest. It's truly the wealth of sources that anybody can access that used to be impossible 20 years ago.
And I'll add another news organization, El Faro in El Salvador, a country near and dear to my heart, is the preeminent news organization in that region, and they do outstanding reporting, prize-winning, kind of Gabriel, God, what am I doing? Gabriel Garcia Marquez style, journalism and storytelling that I think is an important component of any effort to humanize the story. I want to ask you, speaking of Central America, I've spent an adult lifetime covering and dodging bullets around these issues. So, and I remember in 2015 when that child was drowned, along with, by the way, Jean has a great, what's the name of the social science? Your story?
Oh, a story in the Stanford Social Innovation Review
Yeah,
about
maybe
Proactiva Open Arms.
Yeah,
which
maybe the council can link to this. It's such a great story, but that story had an image of like these people that saw just a sea of children drowned. Sad, tragic image. And that one child's image captured the attention of the world. And it captured my attention. But this was at the same time where I was doing some reporting for my book. It comes out next year, HarperCollins. The book that I'm doing on these issues, but in the northern part of the hemisphere, specifically El Salvador. And, we would go to morgues and smell the remains of, unforgettable smell of remains of hundreds of migrants who've died. There's actually thousands have died in the desert, and you go to the desert and you see the bones of the children, but you got to go way out, and it's not as dramatic. And so so the question it raised for me is, you generally don't have reporting, and we all have experience with Central America, by the way. So you don't call Central Americans refugees in the news, generally speaking, but you call people that experience either equal or less levels of extreme violence being called refugees. Why is that? I'm curious. I never had a chance to really ask some serious journalists like the ones we have here.
Well, it's a complicated issue, and it's a political issue. It was a big deal in Europe in 2015 whether we called somebody a migrant or a refugee. And it has to do with international definitions of what a refugee is. And if you are defined as a refugee, you get there's more obligations on the part of nation states to take you in than if you are a migrant, which is more considered a voluntary movement for economic reasons. I'm sure you can add to that, Giovanna.
Well, it is one of the toughest questions, because what you call something, needless to say, will frame the box within which people will then think about it. And, I've seen them all, really. You could say immigrant, migrant, refugee, asylum seeker, and a million other things, foreigner, foreign-born, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the polite ones. Then, of course, there are all sorts of denigratory terms. The law is extremely restrictive on who gets to be defined, who's an asylee or a refugee. Two different things. Don't ask me now. We can in the Q&A in case you're curious. That's international law. It does elicit a very different emotional response, and that's why journalists really struggle with that. At least ethical journalists really struggle with that. I think that's going forward going to be one of the most loaded questions. To give you a sneak preview of this New York Times article that I've just mentioned, they're basically talking about how at this point we might truly have reached finally the moment when we admit that the US immigration system is not workable anymore. It hasn't worked for, the last reform was in 1965, so it's been a long time. But at this point, just the law isn't matching the reality anymore. A lot of experts believe that, and scenes on the ground that I think we've all seen reflect that as well. However, the law is what it is. And right now, there are very stringent definitions, again, in the US and most of the world, about who's a refugee, who's an asylum seeker, who's a migrant. I think one of the biggest issues going forward is going to be for journalists, and I go back to what Jean was saying, to also work out these structural stories. Now, let's face it, they're a little bit more boring. Immigration reform conversations behind closed doors in Congress are boring as heck. They're certainly not as exciting, so to speak, as people coming over walls or, in little life rafts in the Mediterranean. They're much harder to follow, and people, the audience, are less likely to click on them, to tweet them, to comment on them. But I think that we really need to really, really, really dig down and investigate the structural factors behind migration. It's, again, that's not to say the human stories are not important. Of course, ultimately, that's what they are. But human lives are impacted by large structures.
And this makes me think about what I would call the struggle to frame right now. There's I think a titanic struggle right now in journalism and in the world right now to figure out how we frame the refugee crises. And so I think there's people in the state and in government that understand how to do this more often than not in very cynical and calculated ways. And I'll give you an example where, immigrant rights activists talk about the militarization of the border. The media does not use that language. I do, but you have, for example, there's a story in Haaretz that came out last year when, a few months ago, when there was a conflict at the U.S.-Mexico border, and I was fascinated because the journalist at Haaretz had seen what I saw, which was, and here's the title of the story, was "Why Comparing the Mexican and Gaza Borders is Irresistible but Dangerous." The story went on to show how when you frame an immigrant mother and her child, in this smoky area, you have that classic picture, that iconic picture that was taken, you're leaving out a colossal amount of information by focusing on that kind of these issue as some sort of a military conflict. It's same thing with protests, right? When you send out a riot police, you define it as a riot automatically, right? So, so you have in the case of say Turkey and Greece, or in the case of Mexico and the Dominican Republic in this hemisphere, you have these governments acting as buffer zones. The U.S. is even giving a lot of, and the European governments are giving a lot of money to these governments to act as buffer zones so that their militaries, their immigration services are more and more becoming extensions of U.S. immigration, I would say. And so what sorts of challenges does that present us when we're not able, we don't usually talk about Plan Mexico or any other treaty and funding mechanisms that they use to execute U.S. or European will?
I think this points to why we need these stories about context and policy. One of the big things that's happening now are the United States and the EU. We're basically outsourcing our immigration policy. And I saw this very clearly in 2015 and 2016 in the European Union, where Merkel and other leaders wanted to stand up for human rights, but by signing the EU-Turkey deal and saying that Turkey was a safe third country, in a certain way they were outsourcing their policies, because there is a lot of question about whether that's true. And actually it's debatable whether it is a safe country or not. A place where it's not debatable and it's very concerning is Libya. And so what's going on in Libya, I'm just thinking of, there are hundreds of thousands of refugees. And the EU has, as it's turned rightward in these last couple years, and with the new government in Italy, they have shut down all humanitarian operations in the sea. And they have said that Libya is a safe place for refugees, and that the Libyan government should take care, just like we're saying Mexico should take care. And there's a real problem with that. And I think that the EU is, you know, they're involved in a very terrible policy that's affecting a lot of people's lives.
Before we open it up to our audience, last word on this?
I think what Jean brought up is a very contentious issue that is at the core, actually, of refugee law. I'm going to stray into the law here for a second. And that is the question of shared responsibility. In other words, if you look at pretty much all agreements, et cetera, the idea is that because this is a global problem, of course, everybody needs to be involved and share some part of responsibility. You'll take some, I'll take some, you'll take some. If I can take them, I'll pay you, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, the reality has been very clear in the last few years, it doesn't work. So again, we need to look at the processes, we need to ask pointed questions and not just accept black and white, easy solutions on one side or the other. Because again, I think, and Roberto, I wanted to go back to this point. You said words, right, but you focused on refugee, you also said refugee crisis. Is it really a crisis? Has it been a crisis? What does making it sound like a crisis mean? But it's not just refugee that's complicated. Crisis is even more so. What really constitutes a crisis? I would say that to the people who have been forced to flee their homes by violence, by extreme poverty, by climate change, by war, yeah, I mean, it definitely is a crisis to them. But again, how we frame this and how we think about this, and especially what we do and what we hold our elected officials responsible to do towards what I believe, in fact, our crisis is going to be essential. And for that, I think journalism has to play a fundamental role, because it can actually bring people like we're doing tonight in dialogue across partisan perspectives to talk about issues that matter. If it's not journalism, or if journalism becomes partisan, like you both have said, totally partisan, then I really fear for the future of democracy. Allow me one tiny, tiny digression into language, which is this. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I learned on doing the book project is the word for journalist in Greek, in modern Greek, is dimosiographos, which actually means, as I'm sure you can hear a piece of something that you have heard, it means the writer of or for the people. Of course, that's the same root as democracy, which of course is also a Greek-rooted word, the power of the people. And I think the open question is, if we no longer have, or if we have a future without δημοσιογράφος, are we going to have a future with democracies? That, to me, is the biggest question that is facing journalism today.